French President Emmanuel Macron landed in China to a red carpet reception. His visit had all the pomp and grandeur of a state visit. Through his 3-day tour, he was clearly hoping to further his ambitions for France to be able to sit at the table of great powers. Clearly, France wants to be able to shape the narrative in a world that is changed by Russia's invasion of Ukraine and China emerging as a big power. But Macron has been roundly criticized on both sides of the Atlantic, particularly by America and its long-standing European allies. Already embattled at home, facing huge weekly protests out on the streets of Paris and other major cities across the country, Macron now finds himself berated. First, with President Vladimir Putin of Russia, whom he failed to dissuade from going to war, and now with China's President Xi Jinping, who wants to drive a wedge between Europe and the United States. In fact, China has warned of American containment, language which Macron has agreed with. The fallout from Macron's China trip has left the French president more isolated than at any time in his 6-year presidency. He's unpopular in France, and he's not trusted by friends or allies. While in China, Macron managed to alienate or worry allies all the way from Warsaw to Washington with his embrace of a sino-French declaration called the Global Strategic Partnership with China. He adopted the Chinese lexicon and the Chinese vocabulary of a multipolar world that is free of blocks, something that is liberated from the Cold War mentality and less reliant on the US dollar, all of which is language that China uses regularly in its press briefings. Most worrisome in Macron's comments, and particularly for the United States, he suggested in an interview with Politico and other French journalists on the way home that the security of Taiwan is not Europe's problem and that Europeans must resist becoming vassals of America. On Crux Decode, how does France contain the damage arising out of Macron's comments? Will there be a serious division now between America and Europe, not just on the Russia-Ukraine war, but also on how to deal with China? And how will China and Russia use this seeming disagreement to at least test the strength of transatlantic unity, which has been revived after the Ukraine war? The most problematic part about Macron's comments was that he sought to make no distinction between Ukrainian democracy, which all of Europe is fighting for, and Taiwanese democracy, which America is treaty-bound to protect. How Taiwanese democracy and freedom differ from Ukrainian democracy and freedom, and how the threat of Russian autocracy differs from the threat of a Chinese autocracy, these were questions that were left unanswered by Macron. Speaking of Taiwan, he said, and I quote, "The worst thing to happen would be to think that we Europeans must become followers on this topic and take our cue from the US, and a Chinese overreaction as a result of that." Unquote. The comment underscored how there are sharp divisions on the European continent, particularly between frontline states which border Russia that are fiercely attached to NATO now, and France and Germany, on the other hand, which may be taking a slightly more neutral view to this war. Macron is trying to follow his idol, the legendary French leader Charles de Gaulle, and his famous dictum of a France that is allied but not aligned with Washington. Talk of building European strategic autonomy at a time when the United States is providing the vast bulk of military support to Ukraine, that would seem provocative, particularly on the Beltway, especially as America goes into an election year and there is restiveness amongst the Republican Party over the massive spending that America and American taxpayers are making on the Ukraine war effort. Another problem, of course, was timing. Macron spoke just hours before China began threatening military drills around the Taiwan Straits. China flew in over 100 aircraft over a 3-day span, which lasted till early this week. Now, China claims that this was in response to a meeting last week of Taiwan's President Tsai Ing-wen with the Speaker of the United States House of Representatives, Kevin McCarthy, a meeting that happened in California. On the face of it, Taiwan does matter, and does matter a lot to Europe, both for economic and political reasons. The world runs on Taiwanese semiconductor chips, In fact, the island produces over 60% of all the world's semiconductors and almost 90% of the most complicated semiconductors that the world needs. A large majority of these are manufactured by one Taiwanese company, the TSMC, or Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company. After China's crushing of democratic aspirations in Hong Kong, the implications of a Chinese invasion of Taiwan and the suppression of liberal democracy there would be devastating for all liberal democracies, including France. The fallout from Macron's controversial comments was not limited to France's overseas allies alone. Closer home, the French president's call for European autonomy from US foreign policy has exposed divisions within the EU. Even as Macron landed in the Netherlands for a state visit that included a speech on European sovereignty, Polish Prime Minister Mateusz Morawiecki stressed that the alliance with the United States that Europe has is an absolute foundation of European security. That's not all. He went on to say that some Western leaders dream of cooperating with everyone, including with Russia and with some powers in the Far East, in what was an apparent reference to Macron's comments on China and Taiwan. Now, this reaction across the Atlantic was also swift and scathing. Emmanuel Macron fancies himself as a Charles de Gaulle character for the 21st century, which includes distancing Europe from the United States. That was what a scorching Sunday editorial said in the Wall Street Journal. The three-day military drills which China launched around the Taiwan Straits just a day after Macron left China. In fact, people familiar with Macron's thinking said that he was happy that Beijing at least waited until he was out of Chinese airspace before launching the Taiwan exercise. Chinese warplanes and Navy ships were still in the waters around the Taiwan island even as late as Tuesday of this week, that is a day after the drills officially ended. Now, the Taiwan Defense Ministry has sparked off condemnations of China's drills, and in Taiwan, local politicians have also gone ahead and condemned Emmanuel Macron's comments. There was another problem for Macron and for France. Macron has long advocated the concept of strategic autonomy for Europe, and his comments on Taiwan reflected his emphasis on making sovereignty a priority for the European Union. The roots of France's diplomacy of balance date back all the way to the 1950s and 60s to Charles de Gaulle and his attempts to try and counterweigh American dominance. Under de Gaulle, France became the first Western country to recognize the People's Republic of China back in 1964. But nearly 60 years later, with China flexing its military muscles both on land and at sea, many Western foreign policy experts have little patience for this balancing act which Macron seemed to have outlined. Concerns are particularly heightened across the Indo-Pacific, where the interests of the United States, Japan, Australia, France, India, and a number of Southeast Asian countries converge. With its overseas territories in the Indo-Pacific Oceans, France considers itself as an Indo-Pacific resident power. Macron's comments, though, do not exactly convey that France has the best interests of these Quad countries, or for that matter, Southeast Asian countries who've been at the receiving end of China's aggression, that France has their best interests in mind. Clearly, it's going to be a long time before Macron makes a similar visit to Asia, to Tokyo, Seoul, or even Delhi.